So I would say it is important to have critical media literacy education with that emphasis on the critical, in part because we are surrounded by media. We, in many ways, live our lives through the media. It is how we learn about the world around us. It is how we're entertained. It is how we share information with people. Uh, but we are not just surrounded by media content. All of that content that comes to us and all of it that seems to come to us so easily these days by tiny devices that fit in our pockets all have owners and producers, and they need to be distributed. And part of the critical media literacy is making sure that we are looking behind the scenes at that process of ownership, production, and distribution. To just focus on media content leaves out a significant portion of the story, a significant portion not just of what we are seeing, reading, and listening to, but how it got to us in the first place. Uh, I think in critical media literacy, the absence of data is data. And so part of what we also do is explore what might not be getting to us, right? What aren't we learning about? What are we being in some capacity restricted from? So the critical invites us to interrogate, to ask questions, and to look behind the scenes. I think if we kind of go back in time and look at the development of what became, known as the press and then the free press, was this idea of talking back to public officials, talking back to those in power, really making sure that the people, the rest of us, were able to understand what was happening. And I think that's a really valuable and important ideal that might not be held up by corporations, right? By the establishment or the legacy press, because who they're answering to, who the journalists are often answering to, are those corporate powers, right? A truly free and independent press can do that work. It can talk back to the government. It can talk back to corporations. It can talk back to um, corporate power because it is not necessarily being funded by them, right? Can think of the cliche of like, don't bite the hand that feeds, right? So a truly free and independent press is able to look into things with one hopes fewer restrictions, fewer boundaries on what might be hot or what might be popular right now, and more about maybe what regular people need to know, deserve to know, and want to know. um, if I can give a particular example, I think of, the Washington Post, which I think the Washington Post has done some great journalism, right? If we kind of go back in time and look at the Pentagon Papers and look at its coverage of Vietnam, there was some really deep investigative work. But when we move forward in time, the Washington Post is owned by Jeff Bezos, who owns Amazon, who owns Whole Foods. So just as a slice of what could be missing, you're never going to read an article in the Washington Post that is, say, critical of Amazon's labor practices, or critical of Whole Foods labor practices, or quite frankly, Whole Foods prices in this time of inflation when good old fashioned regular people can't afford really to shop at Whole Foods. And yet, because it's such a corporate behemoth, it can kind of come in and take out the mom and pop shops that might have been more affordable or drive those prices up too, because I would imagine their rents go up. We're not going to read about that, right? I'm not saying that Jeff Bezos' divorce is newsworthy. I don't particularly I don't need to crawl inside of anybody else's marriage, but when we read about his divorce in the Washington Post, we're not going to necessarily read about his culpability. We're going to read about it as a thing versus any maybe untoward or inappropriate behavior. That means that we're missing information, right? And that means that we're missing information from the newspaper that originates in the nation's capital. We could be reading that newspaper, any newspaper, cover to cover, but if it's if all of the stories are going to have to answer to a corporate power, reading it cover to cover every single day means that we're still missing information. One of the many things that critical media literacy does is it invites us to ask questions of our media texts. And for the most part, we're probably learning about our politicians and we're probably learning about our elections from the media, right? We could go to a stump speech, we could go to some sort of rally, we might be able to do something in our towns with our local politicians. But for the most part, I would argue that we're learning about them from the media, right? So critical media literacy is going to invite us to, at the very least, at the very beginning, kind of learn how to ask questions about that, right? Our politicians will most likely never know really what's going on behind the scenes with them for years on years. But what we could do is deconstruct the language that they use, deconstruct their own word choices. What are they saying? I think in this age of firebrand topics, we get a lot of um, provocative language, but what's the action behind it, right? I mean, I'm thinking these days of particularly Texas and Florida with, resounding passion for don't say gay in the classroom and anti-LGBTQ work and the absolute attempt to eradicate LGBTQ. But what is the language that they're using? It is often coded as like, we're going to make our classrooms safer for our children. We're going to provide them a solid American education. I don't think our classrooms should be unsafe for children, but I want to know what that means. What does it mean to make a classroom safer for children? I think a learning about American history is probably really valuable, but tell me what you mean by American history, right? What is that? What is exactly that? Because I might walk into it thinking it's one thing, and that person might be pretending that it's something else. So critical media literacy is going to invite us to interrogate that. I think another layer on top of it is also critical media literacy will invite us to interrogate the coverage of what these politicians are saying. How are they framed in a story? Would argue that one really valuable thing that we could do with covering elections is before we even read the story or listen to the story or watch the story or scroll through the story, whatever medium we're using, what's the headline, right? What's the picture? We could learn a lot just from that, right? If we have a picture of a politician mid sneeze, I'm pretty sure that's going to be a negative story, and I haven't even read it yet because, like, nobody looks their best mid sneeze, right? Uh, then what's the opening line? Who's quoted, right? Whose words are we hearing? What does it mean to have an unnamed source, right? I think an unnamed source is something that can cut both ways. It can be sort of a lazy way of trying to actually have evidence. It can also be that that unnamed source might be fearing for their job, and to be unnamed is actually taking a really brave stance, right? But that is our job as critical media teachers, as critical media literacy scholars, and as students of critical media literacy, is to start asking those questions. Now, I do believe that reading, listening to, watching the whole story is incredibly important, but I think we can really start to understand the tone right from the very beginning, the language that is being used, the visuals that are being used. And I think what we also get to do is do compare contrast, right? What does a supposedly named leftist publication write versus a publication that might be more associated with the center or more associated with the conservative or the right wing press? We could have the exact same story told in dramatically different ways. That can be really confusing, and that can be super frustrating, and particularly for those of us that might have a single news source that we look to. Once again, we're getting some information but not all information, and we therefore are potentially kind of shortchanging ourselves on our learning. So being able to do that kind of compare contrast can be really helpful. I think more broadly than an election cycle, but I think it absolutely speaks to an election, is where are we getting our information? And I don't mean that even just by corporate or indie. I mean how, right? If we're getting our information digitally, which so many of us are these days, then we are building our algorithm, right? We're building our digital footprint. And in building that digital footprint, unless we're doing a little extra work, we're going to mostly get information with which we already agree. That's pretty nice, I guess, right? Like that's going to make me potentially walk into my polling place feeling quite confident about my candidate because I haven't necessarily been invited to look at anything else. So critical media literacy will also give us that broader context, right? That an election is very rarely just about the election day, right? It's very rarely just about that thing. It's about the much broader context in which we're in. So what work might we learn to do by engaging in critical media literacy of saying, I got to change my digital footprint a little bit. I got to shift that algorithm up a little bit so that I can actually learn as much as possible about this topic, this person, this issue that I'm interested in.
Yeah, absolutely. The algorithmic bubbles are real.
Yeah. And they
um,
feel quite nice on some days, right?
don't
When,
they?
when things are feeling really horrible, as they often do these days, that algorithmic bubble can remind me that I'm 100% right, right? Well, I think my generation and older have done a really solid job destroying this planet. And I certainly don't want to put the responsibility or the onus on the younger generation, but I really hope that we start to see some solid work being done on the environment. It is past time for action, and I do want to see. And I think when we talk about the environment and climate change, that in and of itself is too broad, right? When we look at certain areas of making better choices or making better decisions, it's easy then to forget that some of those choices and decisions also have devastating possibilities to them. So I would really like to see a kind of a grown-up action plan for taking care of this planet. I am always interested in education, and I'm always disappointed because politicians prior to election day spend so much time talking about education and the value of education, and the importance of educating all of our children. And quite frankly, as much of a critical media literacy scholar as I am, I get sucked into it and I get really hopeful. And then I remember after election day that that's pretty easily forgotten because those under 18 don't vote. So those who are most impacted by educational policy actually have the least amount of say in it. So I'm prepared to be disappointed, and yet will remain somewhat hopeful that we could potentially start talking about education. I'd also like something like policy and regulation to be stripped of its kind of dirty word quality. We need greater social safety nets, and that's not a bad thing. There's nobody in this country that hasn't had some level of support. And in fact, our top billionaires, some of their early funding was government support, it was public funds. Um, and I'd like somebody to be able to start talking about that as a good thing. We are the richest nation in the world who still has embarrassingly abject poverty and housing insecurity and food insecurity, and for that we should be greatly ashamed. And it is not a dirty word to say that folks deserve support, and that our government, who is there to be for the people, of the people, by the people, uh, should absolutely be supporting those folks because that supports all of us.